Hello, I'm David Smith. I learnt to ring horribly long time ago and then had about a 35-year gap and restarted about 10 or 12 years ago. And I've thoroughly enjoyed ringing ever since. I got involved on the sort of more administrative side and became the treasurer, webmaster of a few local societies. Found myself secretary of ANZAB, the Australian New Zealand Association, and was president, about 4 or 5 years ago now. I'm an art tutor. I was one of the people who introduced ART, the Association Ringing Teachers methodology, into Australia. I finished up on Central Council, and this interview is because I'm coming to the end of that term this September, because ANZAB had 4 CC reps, and one of them was unable to continue. I think that was my final year as ANZAB president. So no one else was particularly interested. So I said, I don't know much about Central Council. I'll go along and see what happens. So I went along, found it quite amusing, decided to join the education committee. But there was also this thing called CRAG, the review action group that was being formed at the time, which interested me. So I sort of 50-50 volunteered or was volunteered to join that. Found that interesting. And as a result of that, expressed interest in then joining the Central Council as a trustee and as a member of the executive. And that's quite a few years ago now, and that's now coming to an end. So that's why I find myself here now.
What is a Central Council trustee and why do we have them?
I have to say I'm more familiar, because I'm in a similar position in Australia, with the Australian laws about charities, but effectively there are laws about companies of all sorts in both the UK and in Australia, but charities in particular need particular scrutiny. It's very easy to misuse them and have various sort of rorts and what have you through charities. I'm not suggesting that either ANZAB or Central Council suffers from that particular problem, but the laws are there to prevent misuse of one sort or another, and therefore there have to be trustees and there has to be an executive, and they're basically responsible, amongst other things, for ensuring that the law is complied with, the governance is done properly. So it's a sort of dual role. Some of the time you are doing those governance and legal things, other times you're actually getting on with, I was going to say, steering the way ringing goes internationally and in UK and in Australia. That's a little presumptuous. There are many organisations that are international that have an influence on ringing. Central Council is just one of them, but I think it's a fairly important one.
What made you decide to become a trustee?
It basically followed on from having been a member of the CRAG group. There was quite a lot of recommendations were made, and there was then the possibility that a number of people from that CRAG group would then join the executive and try and put those new ideas and reforms into action. And in the end, 4 of us, Philip Barnes, Clyde Whitaker, Alison Everett and myself, that we're the 2 who are coming to the end of our term, all finished up on the Central Council executive, and indeed formed about a half of the members.
So what do you get out of being a trustee for the Central Council?
I think the feeling of contributing, again, it's easy to overstate this and to feel that one's somehow having a most gigantic and enormous effect on ringing and what a power of good and how much we've achieved. That's vastly overstating the situation. Nevertheless, it is an interesting time for ringing. I think it's changing substantially, in part, well, there are all sorts of reasons, in part because the number of churches, and we must remember that most of the bells are actually owned by churches, a variety of churches in Australia, but predominantly the Church of England in the UK, or in England anyway. The number of churches that are active and flourishing is decreasing. That's causing a change. Traditionally in ringing, very substantial source of new recruits used to be members of the congregation, and that still is the case to some extent. I mean, in Australia, we're still building 1 or 2 or 3 new towers every year, and it's members of the congregation who, by and large, are the new ringers that join as a result. But all that is changing. It's important that ringing I think, keeps abreast of those changes and moves with the times. And in Central Council, that's one of the things that one can do. And feeling that one's contributing towards that is, I think, worthwhile and useful.
So you said your term is coming to an end, so we need to elect some new trustees. How would you put that to somebody to encourage them to nominate themselves?
I think it's a little bit the same as with recruiting generally. You know, there's always this debate amongst ringers as what's the ideal recruit. If someone turns up at the door of the ringing chamber and says, "Oh, what's going on here? Can I be a ringer?" I don't think it's wise to get too worried about what's the ideal person. Are they too young and they'll quit? Are they too old and therefore can't learn? Both of which are gross generalizations. I think anyone who comes along is welcome, and it's very much the same here. I would particularly, though, encourage people who are not sort of the traditional Central Council representative or senior member. And I think it's important that people from these diverse groups, I mean, amongst other things, of course, I don't live in UK, that people who perhaps represent the newer ringers, the less able ringers, have are represented and have their voice heard.
So just to finish up then, is there anything that you would like to say that we haven't covered already about the role of the trustee for Central Council?
I think just that, to some extent, ringing, there is the reputation that some ringers are rather critical of the way things that go on. Central Council for a long time has always done quite a good job, I think, but to some extent the job that it does isn't sort of very sexy. It isn't very much in the public eye in terms of what the typical ringers. I remember when I first joined Central Council and arrived in UK and rang in a town that they knew me slightly, and they said, "Oh, what, are you over here to see your relatives again?" Because that's happened to be where it was. And I said, "No, I'm actually here for a Central Council meeting." And they said, "Good heavens." More or less, you know, have you seen a doctor about that? Which is rather worrying. I think Central Council has changed. It is moving with the times. It's set up work groups. We're looking for a lot of volunteers, and anyone who has any interest or any opinions, don't moan about what's going on. Don't complain to your fellow ringers. Don't write rude letters to Ringing World or in the forums or anything like that. Just get involved and have your say, and that will be appreciated, and I think you'll enjoy it.